The morning sun cast long shadows across the small downtown area of Millbrook, a quiet town where everyone knew everyone else's business. On the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue, an old man sat on a weathered wooden bench that had seen better days. His clothes were wrinkled and faded, his gray beard unkempt, and his shoes had holes that let in the morning dew. People walking by would glance at him, shake their heads, and whisper to each other about the town drunk who spent his days on that bench. Harold Hank Morrison had been sitting on that same bench for nearly 3 years now. Every morning at 7:30, he would shuffle down from his tiny apartment above the old hardware store and take his place on the bench. He carried with him a worn canvas bag that contained everything he owned in the world. A few old photographs, some papers that looked important to him but meaningless to others, and a small American flag that had faded from years of handling. The townspeople had grown tired of seeing him there. Store owners complained that he was bad for business, making their shops look run-down and unwelcoming. Mothers would pull their children to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Teenagers would sometimes throw things at him or make jokes as they passed by. To them, he was just another homeless veteran who couldn't get his life together after the war. What they didn't know was that Hank Morrison had once been Staff Sergeant Harold Morrison of the United States Army, a decorated soldier who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He had led men through some of the most dangerous missions of the war, saving countless lives and earning the respect of everyone who served under him. But those days felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of pain, loss, and a system that had forgotten about him. The trouble started when Hank began talking to himself on the bench. It wasn't loud or disturbing, just quiet conversations that only he could hear. Sometimes he would laugh at something funny that someone had said to him. Other times he would nod seriously as if receiving important information. The townspeople assumed he was losing his mind. Another casualty of too much drinking and too little purpose in life. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the flower shop across the street, had called the police 3 times in the past month. She complained that Hank was scaring away her customers and that something needed to be done about him. The police had come by twice, talked to Hank briefly, and left when they realized he wasn't causing any real trouble. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't satisfied with that response. On this particular Tuesday morning, things were about to change. Officer Jake Patterson, fresh out of the police academy and new to the Millbrook Police Department, was driving his patrol car down Main Street when he spotted the old man on the bench. Jake had heard the other officers talking about the crazy old vet, but had never seen him before. As he drove past, something made him slow down and take a closer look. Hank was holding that small American flag in his hands, running his fingers over it gently as if it were made of the finest silk. There was something in the way he held it, something respectful and careful that caught Jake's attention. Most people who found themselves on the streets treated everything roughly, but this man was treating that old flag like it was precious. Jake pulled his patrol car over and sat there for a moment, watching. He had joined the police force because he wanted to help people, to make a difference in his community. His grandfather had been a veteran of World War II, and Jake had grown up hearing stories about the men who had served their country with honor. Looking at Hank Morrison sitting on that bench, Jake felt something stir inside him that he couldn't quite explain. The radio in his patrol car crackled to life. It was dispatch calling about a disturbance at the convenience store on the other side of town. Jake reached for the radio to respond, but hesitated. Something about the old man on the bench was bothering him. Something that went beyond the complaints from local business owners. There was a dignity in the way Hank sat, a straightness to his back despite his shabby appearance, that suggested there was more to his story than anyone knew. Jake decided to respond to the convenience store call first, but as he drove away, he kept glancing in his rearview mirror at the figure on the bench. The flag was still in Hank's hands, and even from a distance, Jake could see the careful way he was folding it. It reminded him of something he had seen at his grandfather's funeral, the precise military fold that honored the flag and everything it represented. The convenience store call turned out to be nothing serious, just a misunderstanding between a customer and the clerk about a returned item. But Jake's mind kept wandering back to the old man on the bench. When he finished at the store, instead of continuing with his normal patrol route, he found himself driving back toward Main Street. By the time he returned, a small crowd had gathered near the bench. Jake could see Mrs. Henderson standing with her arms crossed, talking animatedly to 2 other shop owners. A few teenagers were standing nearby, and one of them was holding a half-empty soda can as if he was about to throw it. The old man was still sitting on the bench, seemingly unaware of the attention he was drawing, still focused on that flag in his hands. Jake parked his patrol car and got out, feeling the weight of his badge and the responsibility that came with it. He was about to meet Harold Morrison for the first time, though he didn't yet know the man's name or his incredible story. All Jake knew was that something about the situation didn't feel right, and his instincts were telling him to pay attention. As he walked toward the bench, Jake had no idea that he was about to uncover a story of heroism, sacrifice, and honor that would change not only his own life, but the entire town's understanding of the man they had dismissed as just another broken-down veteran. Officer Jake Patterson approached the small crowd with careful steps, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his radio. The tension in the air was thick, and he could see that Mrs. Henderson was working herself up into a state that might lead to trouble. The teenagers were snickering among themselves, and Jake noticed that one of them was indeed holding a soda can, ready to throw it at the old man on the bench. "What seems to be the problem here?" Jake asked in his most professional voice, though inside he was still trying to figure out why he felt so protective of a man he had never met. Mrs. Henderson immediately launched into her complaint. "Officer, this man has been disturbing the peace for months now. He sits here all day, talking to himself, scaring away customers. Just this morning I saw him waving that dirty flag around like he was conducting some kind of ceremony. It's not normal behavior, and it's hurting our businesses." Jake looked over at Hank Morrison, who seemed completely unaware of the commotion around him. The old man was carefully refolding the small American flag, his movements precise and practiced. There was something almost ceremonial about the way he handled it, something that spoke of training and respect rather than the random actions of someone who had lost touch with reality. "Has he threatened anyone? Has he been violent or disruptive?" Jake asked, keeping his voice calm and professional. "Well, no," Mrs. Henderson admitted reluctantly, "but he's clearly not right in the head. Sometimes I see him saluting that flag, and other times he seems to be having conversations with people who aren't there. It's disturbing, Officer Patterson. Something needs to be done." One of the teenagers, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, stepped forward with a smirk on his face. "Yeah, the old drunk is always muttering about Charlie and incoming fire and stuff like that. He's probably dangerous. My dad says all those Vietnam guys came back messed up in the head." Jake felt a flash of anger at the disrespectful tone, but he kept his expression neutral. "I think you boys should move along and find something better to do with your time," he said firmly. The teenagers looked like they wanted to argue, but something in Jake's tone made them think better of it. They shuffled away, though not without a few more snide comments about the crazy old vet. With the crowd beginning to disperse, Jake approached the bench where Hank Morrison sat. Up close, he could see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. The old man's clothes were worn and faded, but they were clean. His beard was unkempt, but his fingernails were trimmed and his hands were steady. Most importantly, Jake could see the way Hank held himself, even sitting on that old bench. There was a military bearing there, a straightness to his spine that spoke of years of discipline and training. "Good morning, sir," Jake said respectfully, choosing his words carefully. "I'm Officer Patterson. I wanted to check and see if you were doing all right today." Hank looked up at him with clear blue eyes that seemed to take in everything about Jake in a single glance. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Hank nodded slowly and said, "Morning, officer. I'm doing fine, thank you for asking. Just paying my respects as usual." Jake sat down on the bench beside him, ignoring the looks from the remaining shopkeepers across the street. "Paying respects to who, if you don't mind me asking?" Hank was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still working over the small flag. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear, nothing like the rambling that people had described. "To the boys who didn't make it home, officer. To Private Rodriguez, who took shrapnel meant for me outside Da Nang. To Corporal Williams, who stepped on a mine while walking point so the rest of us wouldn't have to. To Sergeant Murphy, who died in my arms calling for his mother." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't the ranting of a disturbed mind. This was the careful, respectful remembrance of a soldier honoring his fallen comrades. "You served in Vietnam," Jake said quietly. It wasn't a question. 2 tours, Hank confirmed. 1st Cavalry Division, then later with the 101st Airborne. "Lost a lot of good men over there, officer. Good men who deserved better than they got. both during the war and after we came home. Jake was beginning to understand what he had been witnessing. The conversations with invisible people weren't the signs of mental illness. They were a veteran talking to the memories of friends who had died in service to their country. The careful handling of the flag wasn't random behavior. It was a daily ritual of respect and remembrance. The people in town, they don't understand what they're seeing, Jake said carefully. Hank gave a bitter laugh. No, they don't. They see an old man on a bench talking to himself and they assume I've lost my mind. What they don't see is me talking to Billy Thompson about the baseball game we never got to finish, or asking Jim Harrison if he thinks his daughter graduated from college like he always hoped she would. Jake felt his respect for the old man growing with every word. How long have you been coming to this bench? 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Hank answered without hesitation. Ever since I lost my apartment and ended up in that little room above Murphy's Hardware. This bench faces east toward the sunrise. Every morning I come here and I remember them, and I make sure they know they haven't been forgotten. The pieces were starting to come together for Jake. This wasn't a homeless drunk causing trouble for local businesses. This was a veteran who had somehow fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to take care of those who had served. A man who had lost his home, possibly his family, maybe his job, but who still maintained his dignity and his duty to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Mr. Morrison, Jake said, reading the name from a piece of mail that was sticking out of Hank's canvas bag. May I ask what happened? How did you end up here? Hank looked at him with surprise. It had been a long time since anyone had called him by his name or asked about his story with genuine interest rather than judgment. You really want to know, Officer Patterson? Yes, sir, I do. Hank took a deep breath and began to tell his story, starting with the day he received his draft notice in 1968 and ending with the chain of events that had led him to this bench 3 years ago. As Jake listened, he realized he was hearing about a life of service, sacrifice, and loss that the people of Millbrook had never bothered to learn about. They had judged Hank based on his appearance and his circumstances, never taking the time to discover the hero who sat among them every day. As Hank Morrison began to share his story, Jake Patterson found himself transported to a different time and place. The old man's voice remained steady and clear as he described his early days in the Army, but Jake could hear the weight of memory in every word. I was 19 when I got drafted, Hank began, his eyes focused on something far beyond the street in front of them. Farm boy from Nebraska, never been more than 50 miles from home. Thought I knew what hard work was until I hit basic training at Fort Benning, but I was strong and I was determined to do my duty for my country. Jake listened intently as Hank described his arrival in Vietnam in early 1969. The heat, the humidity, the constant awareness that danger could come from any direction at any moment. But what struck Jake most was how Hank talked about his fellow soldiers, the men who became his brothers in ways that civilians could never understand. Rodriguez was just 18, younger than me, but he had this laugh that could lift your spirits even in the worst situations. Hank continued. He used to write letters to his girlfriend back in Texas every single day, carried her picture in his helmet, talked about the wedding they were planning when he got home. He was supposed to rotate out just 2 weeks after he died. Hank paused to carefully fold the flag again, his movements automatic and practiced. Jake noticed that his hands never shook, despite everything he had been through. There was still a soldier's precision in his actions. Murphy was our squad leader, best man I ever served under. He could read the jungle like it was a book, knew when something wasn't right before the rest of us even sensed danger, saved our lives more times than I can count. But even Murphy couldn't save himself when that sniper got him during our second tour. Jake was beginning to understand the depth of loss that Hank carried with him every day. These weren't just war stories. They were memories of real people who had trusted each other with their lives, who had formed bonds that death couldn't break. After Murphy died, they made me acting squad leader, Hank said quietly, gave me sergeant stripes and told me to keep the boys alive. I tried my best, Officer Patterson. I really did. But war doesn't care how hard you try or how much you love the men under your command. Hank went on to describe the mission that would change his life forever. It was near the end of his second tour, just 3 weeks before he was scheduled to return home. Intelligence had indicated that there was a prisoner of war camp hidden in a valley about 20 miles from their base. The mission was supposed to be simple. Get in, verify the location, call for backup, and extract any American prisoners they found. We went in at dawn with 12 men, Hank said, his voice becoming quieter. Good soldiers, every one of them. Williams was walking point because he had the best eyes in the unit. Thompson and Harrison were covering our flanks. Young Peters was carrying the radio, excited because this was going to be his first real mission. Jake could see the pain in Hank's eyes as he continued the story. The mission had gone wrong from the beginning. The intelligence was bad, and instead of a small prison camp, they walked into a heavily fortified enemy position. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a valley with no easy way out. Williams stepped on the mine about an hour into the mission, Hank said, his hands gripping the flag tighter. He must have known what was happening because he tried to wave us back, tried to warn us. But there wasn't time. The explosion, it was like the whole world came apart. In the chaos that followed, Hank had to make decisions that no 19-year-old should ever have to make. With Williams dead and several men wounded, they were pinned down by enemy fire with no clear escape route. The radio was damaged and they couldn't call for help. I had to choose who to save, Hank said simply. Peters was bleeding bad from shrapnel, but he was conscious and could still move. Rodriguez had taken a round in the chest and was fading fast. Thompson had a leg wound but was still fighting. I couldn't carry them all. Jake felt his throat tighten as he listened. He had never been in combat, never faced the kind of impossible choices that Hank was describing. The training at the police academy had prepared him for many things, but not for understanding the weight of command in a life-or-death situation. I got 5 of them out, Hank continued. 5 out of 12. Carried Peters on my back for 6 miles while Thompson limped along beside us. Rodriguez died in my arms about halfway back to base. Kept asking me to tell his Maria that he loved her. I promised him I would, and I kept that promise when I got home. The story didn't end with that mission. Hank described coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about Vietnam, didn't want to acknowledge what their soldiers had been through. There were no parades, no heroes welcome. Just suspicion and sometimes outright hostility from people who had never worn a uniform. I tried to go back to farming, but the nightmares made it hard to sleep, Hank said. Every sudden noise, every unexpected shadow, and I was back in that valley watching my boys die. My father didn't understand why I couldn't just put it behind me and get on with my life. Jake was beginning to see how a decorated war hero had ended up sitting on a bench in a small town, dismissed by people who had no idea what he had sacrificed for them. It was a story of service rewarded with indifference, of heroism met with misunderstanding. I married my high school sweetheart when I got back, Hank continued. Sweet girl named Linda who thought love could heal everything. We tried to make it work for 15 years, but the war followed me home. The drinking started small, just a beer or two to help me sleep. But the nightmares kept getting worse and the drinking kept getting heavier. The pattern was one that Jake had heard about in his training, though hearing it from someone who had lived it made it real in a way that textbooks never could. A veteran struggling with trauma that no one understood, self-medicating with alcohol, slowly losing everything that mattered to him while the people around him grew frustrated with his inability to just get over it. Jake listened with growing respect and sadness as Hank continued his story. The old man's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the pain in his eyes as he talked about the years after Vietnam. Linda tried to understand, she really did, Hank said, carefully adjusting the flag in his hands. But how do you explain to someone who's never been in combat why you wake up screaming 3 times a week? How do you tell the woman you love that sometimes when she touches you while you're sleeping, you think you're back in the jungle and someone's trying to kill you? The marriage had lasted 15 years, longer than many veteran marriages of that era. Linda had stood by Hank through the nightmares, the drinking, and the long periods when he would disappear into himself and become unreachable. But there was only so much one person could take. The final straw was when I grabbed her arm during one of my episodes, Hank said quietly. I thought she was an enemy soldier trying to sneak up on me. I didn't hurt her, but I could have. She was scared of me after that, and I don't blame her. I was scared of myself. Linda had left in 1987, taking their daughter Sarah with her. Sarah had been only 12 years old, and Hank's relationship with her had already been strained by his condition. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the real reason was the war that Hank couldn't leave behind. I tried to stay in contact with Sarah, but Linda thought it was better if I kept my distance, Hank explained. Maybe she was right. A 12-year-old girl shouldn't have to see her father the way I was back then. I was drinking a bottle of whiskey a day and talking to dead soldiers in my sleep. After the divorce, Hank had worked a series of jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Construction work, factory jobs, anything that didn't require him to deal with people too much. But the drinking kept getting worse, and employers in small towns talked to each other. Word got around that Hank Morrison was unreliable, that he might show up to work still drunk from the night before. I lost my last steady job about 5 years ago, Hank continued. Factory work at the plant outside of town. I'd been there for 3 years, longest I'd held a job since the divorce, but I had a bad episode one night. Woke up the whole apartment building screaming about incoming mortars. Landlord said I had to go. That was when Hank's slide from working poor to homeless had really begun. Without steady income, he couldn't afford rent on even the cheapest apartments. He had bounced between shelters, stayed with acquaintances who would tolerate him for a few weeks at a time, and eventually ended up sleeping in his car when he still had one. The VA tried to help, Hank said, though Jake could hear the frustration in his voice. Lots of forms to fill out, lots of appointments to keep. But the waiting lists were long and the counselors kept changing. Hard to tell your story over and over again to people who look at you like you're just another broken-down vet taking up space. Jake felt anger building inside him as he listened. Here was a man who had served his country with honor, who had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, who had sacrificed his youth and his peace of mind in a war that his country had asked him to fight. And the system that should have taken care of him had failed him at every turn. 3 years ago, old Murphy, who owns the hardware store, he found me sleeping behind his building in the middle of winter. Hank said with a slight smile. Different. Murphy than my squad leader, no relation, but a good man. He offered me the little room upstairs in exchange for helping out around the store sometimes. It's not much, but it's warm and dry, and it's the closest thing to home I've had in years. That explained how Hank had ended up on the bench every morning. The room above the hardware store faced the alley, but the bench faced east toward the sunrise. For a man who needed to honor his fallen comrades every day, the direction mattered. Murphy understands about the war, Hank continued. His older brother died in Korea, so he knows what it's like for families who lose someone in service. He doesn't ask questions when I have bad nights, and he doesn't complain when I need to come down here to talk to the boys. Jake was beginning to understand the full scope of what he was witnessing. The people of Millbrook saw a homeless drunk, talking to himself, but the reality was much more complex. Hank Morrison was a war hero who had been failed by almost every system designed to help him, yet he maintained his dignity and his duty to honor the dead. The Bronze Star and the Purple Heart are in that bag, Hank said, nodding toward his canvas satchel, along with some letters from the families of the men I saved. Rodriguez's girlfriend, Maria, she wrote to me after the war to thank me for keeping my promise to tell her about his last moments. Thompson's mother sends me a Christmas card every year, says I'm the son she never had because I brought her boy home alive. Jake felt a lump forming in his throat. This man sitting beside him on a worn wooden bench was carrying more honor and sacrifice than most people would ever know. The medals hidden in that old bag represented real heroism, real lives saved under the worst possible circumstances. Why don't you tell people about your service? Jake asked. Why don't you let them know who you really are? Hank was quiet for a long moment, watching a young mother push her baby stroller down the sidewalk across the street. She glanced over at them and quickened her pace, pulling her older child closer to her side. Look at me, Officer Patterson, Hank said simply. I'm an old man with holes in his shoes and whiskey on his breath most mornings. You think anyone's going to believe that I was once a soldier they would have been proud to serve under? You think anyone cares about what I did 50 years ago when all they can see is what I am now? Jake realized that Hank had a point. The people of Millbrook had already made up their minds about him based on his appearance and circumstances. They weren't interested in looking deeper, in learning about the man behind the shabby clothes and the daily routine on the bench. But Jake was interested, and as he sat there listening to Hank's story, he was forming a plan that might change everything for the old veteran and for the town that had misjudged him so completely. Jake Patterson left the bench that morning with his mind racing. He had gone from responding to complaints about a troublesome vagrant to discovering a genuine American hero sitting right in the heart of his town. But he knew that simply telling people about Hank's service record wouldn't be enough. People had already formed their opinions, and changing minds would require something more dramatic than just words. That afternoon, Jake found himself at the Millbrook Public Library, using their computer to research everything he could find about Harold Morrison's military service. What he discovered made his respect for the old man grow even deeper. Hank hadn't told him everything about his heroism in Vietnam. The Bronze Star citation described how Staff Sergeant Morrison had single-handedly held off an enemy assault while evacuating wounded soldiers under heavy fire. The Purple Heart was for wounds he received during that same action, wounds he had never mentioned during their conversation. There were also commendation letters from his commanding officers, describing his leadership, courage, and dedication to his men. But Jake also found newspaper articles from Hank's hometown in Nebraska, stories about the local boy who had become a war hero. There were photos of a young, clean-shaven soldier in dress uniform, looking proud and strong. The contrast with the man on the bench was heartbreaking, but it also gave Jake an idea. Over the next several days, Jake made it a point to stop by the bench during his patrols. Each conversation revealed more about Hank's character and his service. The old veteran had not only served with distinction in Vietnam, but had also been involved in community service when he first returned home. He had coached Little League Baseball, volunteered at the local VFW, and worked with other veterans who were struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. "I used to speak at high schools about military service," Hank told Jake during one of their conversations. "Back in the 70s and early 80s, before the drinking got too bad. Tried to help kids understand what serving their country really meant, not the Hollywood version, but the real thing." Jake learned that Hank had also been married longer than he had initially indicated. Linda had actually stayed with him for 22 years, not 15. She had been a saint, according to Hank, trying everything she could think of to help him deal with his trauma. Marriage counseling, different doctors, even moving to different towns to give him fresh starts. "She saved my life more times than she knew," Hank admitted. "There were nights when I wanted to give up completely, when the guilt and the nightmares seemed like more than I could handle. But I couldn't leave her alone, couldn't put that burden on her, so I kept fighting, kept trying to be the man she married." The more Jake learned about Hank Morrison, the more he realized that the town's treatment of him was not just unfair, it was a disgrace. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything for his country and his fellow soldiers, and his community had turned their backs on him when he needed support the most. Jake began to formulate a plan. Memorial Day was approaching, just 2 weeks away. Every year, Millbrook held a small ceremony at the town square to honor veterans and fallen soldiers. It was usually a modest affair with a few speeches from local politicians and a wreath-laying ceremony. But this year, Jake thought, it could be something more. First, he approached Chief Williams, his supervisor at the police department. Chief Williams was a fair man who had served briefly in the Navy during peacetime, and he understood the importance of honoring military service. When Jake explained what he had learned about Hank Morrison, the chief was both surprised and interested. "You're telling me that old guy on the bench is a decorated Vietnam veteran?" Chief Williams asked, looking through the research Jake had compiled. "Bronze Star, Purple Heart, commendations from his commanding officers?" "Yes, sir. And not just any veteran. He was a squad leader who saved multiple lives under fire. The men who served with him consider him a hero." Chief Williams studied the documents for a long moment. "What do you have in mind, Patterson?" Jake outlined his plan. He wanted to use the Memorial Day ceremony to properly honor Hank Morrison, and in doing so, educate the community about the man they had been dismissing. But he knew it had to be done right, with Hank's permission and in a way that would truly change hearts and minds. The chief approved the plan, and Jake began making phone calls. He contacted the American Legion post in the next town over, explaining the situation and asking for their support. He reached out to local newspaper editors and radio station managers. Most importantly, he began tracking down some of the men who had served with Hank in Vietnam. It took several days of detective work, but Jake was able to locate 3 veterans who had been in Hank's unit during the war. 2 of them lived within driving distance, and all 3 were eager to participate in honoring their former squad leader. "Sergeant Morrison saved my life twice in Vietnam," said Robert Thompson, now a retired postal worker living about 60 miles away. "I've been looking for him for 30 years, wondering what happened to him. If he's struggling, then we need to help him. That's what soldiers do for each other. Jake also contacted Maria Santos, the woman who had been Rodriguez's girlfriend. She was now Maria Rodriguez Santos, having taken his last name even though they never married. And she had become a successful teacher and community leader in Texas. When Jake explained the situation, she immediately offered to come to Millbrook for the ceremony. Rodriguez talked about Sergeant Morrison in every letter he wrote, she told Jake over the phone. He said Morrison was the kind of leader who would die before he let anything happen to his men. If that man is in need, then I will do whatever I can to help. But the most important conversation Jake had was with Hank himself. On a quiet Thursday morning, Jake approached the bench with a serious expression on his face. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something important, Jake began. How would you feel about being recognized for your service at this year's Memorial Day ceremony? Hank looked surprised, then skeptical. I don't think people around here would be interested in hearing about an old drunk's war stories, Officer Patterson. What if I told you that some of the men you served with want to be there? What if I told you that Rodriguez's girlfriend, Maria, wants to come and meet the man who held her boyfriend while he died? For the first time since Jake had known him, Hank Morrison's composure cracked. Tears began to form in the old veteran's eyes as he realized that his sacrifices had not been forgotten by the people who mattered most. The families of the men he had served with and the soldiers whose lives he had saved. Memorial Day morning dawned clear and bright in Millbrook. The town square had been decorated with American flags and red, white, and blue bunting. But this year's ceremony promised to be different from all the others. Word had spread through the small town that something special was planned. Though most people didn't know exactly what to expect, Jake Patterson had spent the past 2 weeks working tirelessly to organize what he hoped would be a day that changed everything for Hank Morrison and for the community that had misjudged him. The old veteran had agreed to participate, though he remained nervous about being the center of attention after years of being ignored or dismissed. Early that morning, Jake had helped Hank get ready for the ceremony. Murphy from the hardware store had quietly provided a clean shirt and pressed pants, while Jake had arranged for a local barber to give Hank a haircut and trim his beard. When Hank looked at himself in the mirror, Jake could see glimpses of the proud soldier he had once been. I haven't worn a tie in 15 years, Hank said, fumbling with the knot. His hands were shaking slightly. Whether from nerves or from the effort of staying sober for the past week, Jake couldn't tell. You look like a soldier, Mr. Morrison, Jake said honestly. You look like the hero you've always been. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock, but people had started gathering in the town square by 9:30. Jake was pleased to see a larger crowd than usual, including faces he didn't recognize. Word had spread beyond Millbrook's borders, and veterans from neighboring towns had come to participate in honoring one of their own. Mrs. Henderson was there, looking somewhat puzzled by all the attention being given to what she still thought of as the town drunk. The teenagers who had been ready to throw things at Hank just 2 weeks earlier were also present, brought by their parents who had heard rumors about the day's events. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mayor Davidson stepped up to the microphone that had been set up on the gazebo. He was a kind man who genuinely cared about his community, though he had been unaware of Hank's story until Jake brought it to his attention. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this Memorial Day, as we honor those who have served our country. The mayor began. Today's ceremony is particularly special because we will be recognizing someone who has been living among us. Someone whose service and sacrifice we should have acknowledged long ago. Jake could see Hank standing at the edge of the crowd, still uncertain about his role in the proceedings. Next to him stood Robert Thompson and James Peters, 2 of the men who had served in his unit in Vietnam. They had arrived the night before, and their reunion with their former squad leader had been emotional and healing for all 3 men. I want to introduce Officer Jake Patterson, who will tell us about a hero who has been sitting on a bench in our town square, waiting for us to recognize what he did for our country, Mayor Davidson continued. Jake stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding. He had practiced this speech dozens of times, but he knew that the next few minutes would determine whether his plan succeeded in changing hearts and minds. 2 weeks ago, I responded to complaints about a man who was supposedly disturbing the peace, Jake began. What I found was Staff Sergeant Harold Morrison, United States Army decorated veteran of the Vietnam War, holder of the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, and one of the finest soldiers our country has ever produced. A murmur ran through the crowd. People were looking around, trying to figure out who Jake was talking about. Mrs. Henderson's eyes went wide as she began to understand. Jake continued, telling Hank's story with the respect and detail it deserved. He described the young farm boy from Nebraska who had answered his country's call, the squad leader who had saved the lives of his men under fire, and the veteran who had been failed by the very society he had fought to protect. Every morning for the past 3 years, Sergeant Morrison has come to that bench to honor his fallen comrades, Jake explained. What we saw as a homeless man talking to himself was actually a soldier conducting a daily memorial service for the friends he lost in Vietnam. The conversations we couldn't understand were his way of keeping faith with men who died serving our country. As Jake spoke, he could see the faces in the crowd changing. Shame and recognition were replacing judgment and dismissal. Mrs. Henderson had tears in her eyes, and several of the teenagers were looking down at their feet in embarrassment. Today, I want you to meet some special guests who have traveled here to honor Sergeant Morrison, Jake continued. Mr. Robert Thompson and Mr. James Peters served under Sergeant Morrison in Vietnam. They are alive today because of his courage and leadership. Thompson stepped forward, a dignified man in his 70s wearing his American Legion uniform. Hank Morrison saved my life twice in Vietnam, he said into the microphone, his voice strong and clear. Once when he carried me 6 miles to safety with a leg wound, and once when he pulled me out of a burning helicopter. I've been looking for him for 30 years, hoping to thank him properly. Peters, who had been the young radio operator in Hank's squad, spoke next. Sergeant Morrison was the kind of leader who put his men first always. When we were trapped in that valley and everything went wrong, he kept us together and got us home. I wouldn't be here today without him, and neither would my children or grandchildren. Then Jake introduced Maria Santos, who had flown in from Texas to be part of the ceremony. She was now a grandmother herself, but she still carried the letter that Rodriguez had been writing to her when he died. Sergeant Morrison held my boyfriend in his arms while he died, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He promised Carlos that he would tell me how much he loved me, and he kept that promise. For 50 years I have wanted to meet the man who gave Carlos comfort in his final moments. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Jake could see that his plan was working. The people of Millbrook were finally seeing Hank Morrison not as a burden or a problem, but as a hero who deserved their respect and gratitude. Finally, Jake called Hank forward. The old veteran walked slowly to the microphone, his back straight and his bearing proud despite his nervousness. The crowd parted respectfully as he passed, and several people reached out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. I want to thank you all for being here today, Hank said, his voice steady despite his emotion. I never expected anything like this. For most of my life since Vietnam, I've felt forgotten, like the service of my generation didn't matter to people anymore. But Officer Patterson and all of you have shown me that I was wrong. Hank paused to look out at the crowd, many of whom were now crying openly. I want you to know that the men who didn't come home from Vietnam were better soldiers and better men than I ever was. Rodriguez, Williams, Murphy, Harrison, and all the others, they deserve to be remembered. That's all I've been trying to do on that bench every morning. Just remember them and make sure they know they haven't been forgotten, Mayor. Davidson then presented Hank with a key to the city and announced that the bench where he conducted his daily remembrances would be officially designated as the Harold Morrison Memorial Bench, with a plaque honoring both Hank and the men he remembered every day. But the biggest surprise came when Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from the crowd. With tears streaming down her face, she approached Hank and took his hands in hers. Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I was wrong about you, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. You are a hero, and you deserve better from all of us. One by one, other members of the community came forward to apologize and to thank Hank for his service. The teenagers who had mocked him asked for his forgiveness. Local business owners offered him jobs and support. The transformation was complete and genuine. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Jake found himself standing with Hank beside the bench that had started it all. The old veteran was holding his small American flag, but now he wasn't alone with his memories. You did this for me, Hank said to Jake, his voice full of gratitude. You took the time to listen and to understand when everyone else had given up on me. Jake shook his head. I just helped people see what was already there, Sergeant. You're the hero. You always have been. From that day forward, Hank Morrison was no longer the forgotten veteran on the bench. He became an honored member of the Millbrook community. a man whose daily ritual of remembrance was understood and respected. And every morning as he sat on his bench facing the sunrise, he was no longer alone with his memories. Members of the community would often join him, learning about the men he honored and understanding the true cost of freedom. Jake Patterson had learned something important too. Sometimes being a good police officer meant more than enforcing laws and responding to calls. Sometimes it meant taking the time to really see people, to listen to their stories, and to help a community understand the heroes who walk among them every day.